You are standing on the stone quay at La Rochelle long after sunset, when the port should have been settling into routine silence. Yet something feels wrong. The tide is high. The wind is steady. Ships sit low in the water, heavier than they should be at this hour, their hulls creaking softly, as if impatient. By morning, every one of them will be gone. Not damaged, not delayed. Gone so completely that no wreckage will ever surface, no survivor will ever testify, and no official record will ever admit where they sailed. 7 centuries later, the question still hangs in the air like mist over dark water. How does an entire fleet vanish in a single night, leaving nothing solid enough to blame on the sea, the king, or even chance itself? The urgency begins to loosen its grip now. The sharp edges of that question soften, and the pace slows, inviting you to breathe more evenly, to step back from the noise of speculation and into a quieter space where the past does not shout, but waits. You remain at the harbor, letting the details settle around you. The smell of salt and pitch lingers in the air. Lantern light trembles across the surface of black water. La Rochelle, in the early 14th century, was not a forgotten port on the edge of Europe. It was a financial artery, a strategic outlet, and quietly the most important maritime gateway controlled by the Knights Templar. These were not the romantic figures later painted into legend. They were administrators, bankers, and logisticians, men who understood timing, contingency, and discretion with professional precision. When they moved ships, they did so with intent. You already know how their public story ends, or at least how it is usually told. Arrest warrants issued in silence, confessions drawn out in cold rooms, fires constructed carefully beam by beam. Yet the ships refuse to fit that ending. They leave before the trap closes. They depart as if someone had spoken a warning at exactly the right moment, quietly, efficiently, without drama. You can almost imagine it, a messenger arriving late, breath shallow, a seal pressed into warm wax, a single instruction passed from ear to ear. Sail. Tonight. There is an odd calm to this mystery, and even a faint trace of irony if you allow yourself a tired smile. History is filled with chaotic collapses, yet here is an order facing destruction that pauses to pack properly, check the weather, and slip out through the back door. No speeches, no heroic last stand, just competence, almost impolite in its efficiency. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Let the harbor fade behind you. The ropes are already cast off. The fleet is already moving. You remain by the harbor, but time begins to slide backward, smoothing the water and rebuilding the noise that once lived here. La Rochelle, at dusk in the autumn of 1307, was not dramatic in the way later painters imagined it. It was practical, busy, and faintly impatient. The port functioned as a machine, and machines do not pause for legend. Stone quays were crowded with barrels, coils of rope crates stamped with merchants' marks, and sailors who moved with the efficient boredom of men repeating familiar tasks. This matters because disappearances rarely succeed in chaos. They succeed in routine. Historically, La Rochelle was the principal Atlantic port under Templar control, a fact rarely disputed by serious scholars. The order had been granted extensive privileges here decades earlier, including warehouses, docking rights, and exemption from certain tolls. You can picture the Templar banner hanging quietly above administrative buildings, rather than fluttering heroically from battlements. This was not a fortress of crusading glory. It was a logistics hub. Ships came and went, constantly carrying wine, salt, wool, pilgrims' letters, and money. In such a place, movement did not automatically attract attention. That is the first key. As evening settled, the fleet would not have looked like a fleet in the theatrical sense. Contemporary references suggest a loose collection of vessels rather than a single formation cogs carracks and smaller support ships suited for coastal and open water travel. The exact number remains debated, with estimates ranging from a handful to more than a dozen. The absence of consensus is not a failure of scholarship so much as a clue. If records disagree even on how many ships left, it suggests that whatever departed did so under conditions designed to blur counting, not clarify it. One well-established detail anchors this reconstruction. Medieval ports closed their gates at night, but ships already cleared for departure could leave on the tide without further inspection. Harbor masters relied on paperwork completed earlier in the day, not midnight roll calls. If documents were prepared in advance, and if no cargo appeared overtly suspicious, the physical act of sailing required little ceremony. You can imagine a clerk yawning over a ledger, unaware that his routine entries would later become the silence historians argue over. More obscure and more controversial is the question of who exactly gave the final signal. Some historians argue that local Templar commanders acted autonomously, reading political weather better than royal messengers. Others suggest coordination from higher leadership, perhaps even from Jacques de Molay himself, though no surviving letter confirms this. The debate remains unresolved, and it hinges on timing. Orders issued too early would attract suspicion. Orders issued too late would trap the ships in port. Whoever made the decision understood that narrow window with unnerving accuracy. You can sense how deliberate the atmosphere must have been. Sailors loading late into the evening would not have seemed unusual in La Rochelle. Longshoremen were accustomed to irregular hours dictated by tides rather than clocks. Even the presence of armed brothers overseeing the process would not have raised eyebrows. Templars guarded property as a matter of course. In a port where they owned warehouses, oversight looked like habit, not alarm. There is a quiet irony here, and perhaps a small joke history never intended. Philip IV, meticulous in his financial accounting and ruthless in his legal maneuvers, was undone not by chaos, but by predictability. He understood courts' parchments and confessions. He underestimated docks, bureaucracy. It turns out is far less vigilant when everyone assumes tomorrow will look like yesterday. As the light faded, ships would have cast off not all at once, but gradually blending into the normal rhythm of departures. A vessel leaving on the evening tide did not announce itself with trumpets. It slid away. Another followed. Then another. By full dark, the harbor looked much as it always did, minus a few silhouettes that no one thought to memorize. This is where the mystery sharpens. If the departure was ordinary enough to escape notice, it was also organized enough to remove an entire maritime capability in one coordinated motion. Scholars continue to argue over whether royal agents were present that night, watching but not intervening. Some point to later testimony hinting at surveillance. Others counter that such witnesses spoke years later under pressure, their memories shaped by fear rather than accuracy. The lack of contemporary complaints from harbor officials suggests either ignorance or complicity, and neither option is comforting. Silence can indicate innocence, but it can also indicate that everyone understood the benefit of forgetting. You might recall the weight of the ships you imagined earlier sitting low in the water. That detail returns now with sharper meaning. Heavily laden vessels require careful timing to avoid grounding, especially in tidal ports. Whoever planned this departure calculated not just secrecy, but physics. They trusted the harbor, the tide, and their crews. No panic, no improvisation. Just execution. By the time the sun rose, La Rochelle woke to familiarity. Fishermen prepared their nets. Merchants opened shutters. The absence of Templar ships did not scream disaster. It whispered inconvenience. And whispers are easily ignored, especially when louder events are about to unfold inland. Arrests would soon command attention. Accusations would flood the air. Meanwhile, the water remained calm, as if nothing of consequence had passed across it at all. The harbor, indifferent as ever, kept its secret. The harbor's calm the next morning depended on a quieter absence that took longer to notice. It was not just the ships that were gone, but the paper trail that should have followed them. Medieval ports lived on documentation. Cargo lists, docking fees, toll exemptions, and customs tallies formed the invisible scaffolding of maritime trade. Ships could slip away under cover of routine, but records were meant to remain. And yet, when historians comb through what survives from La Rochelle, they encounter a peculiar emptiness where the fleet should be. One solid fact anchors this unease. Royal and municipal archives from the early 14th century are fragmentary, but not randomly so. Records before and after October 1307 survive in usable condition, detailing ordinary departures, shipments of wine salt exports, and tax assessments. What is conspicuously thin are the documents that would normally describe a coordinated movement of Templar vessels. This absence has been noted by serious scholars for decades, and while gaps in medieval archives are common gaps that align so neatly with a single event, invite suspicion rather than resignation. The simplest explanation would be loss through time. Fires, damp, neglect, and war have consumed countless parchments. But this is where the problem deepens. Other ports of similar size show damage that is uneven and chaotic. La Rochelle's missing material, by contrast, feels selective. Routine merchant traffic remains visible, while anything clearly tied to the Templar fleet dissolves into vagueness. It is as if someone removed not the books themselves, but the pages that mattered most, leaving the rest to age naturally. An obscure but persistent interpretation suggests that no manifests were ever filed in the usual way. Templar ships often operated under privileges that exempted them from standard customs inspections, a perk granted decades earlier in exchange for military service and financial support to the crown. If the fleet sailed under internal authorization using pre-approved exemptions, the paperwork might never have reached municipal archives at all. This would not have seemed alarming at the time. Privilege, when exercised repeatedly, becomes invisible. Here, the memory of the previous evening's routine returns. The harbor worked on trust. Clerks assumed tomorrow would resemble yesterday. A ship cleared in the afternoon did not need to announce itself again at night. If a manifest had been logged days earlier describing cargo in vague terms, no one would rush to amend it, just because a vessel departed slightly sooner than expected. Bureaucracy is patient. It waits to be questioned. Yet there is another layer more controversial that scholars argue over quietly. Some believe that records did exist and were later suppressed during the legal assault on the order. Philip IV's campaign was not only about arrests, it was about controlling narrative. Confiscation of property required justification. Missing ships complicated that story. If ledgers showed valuable assets leaving royal reach just before the crackdown, they would undermine claims that the crown seized everything lawfully owed to it. Silence in that context becomes convenient. The debate hinges on intent. Were documents quietly destroyed after the fact, or were they never created with precision to begin with? No surviving order commands clerks to erase evidence, but absence does not require a written decree. Fear accomplishes much without ink. When arrests began, officials across France scrambled to protect themselves. Few incentives existed to preserve material that might suggest negligence or complicity. You might smile faintly at the human element here. Medieval administrators were not immune to the instinct. Modern ones know well if a file threatens your future, misplace it. Accidentally. Permanently. History often imagines conspiracies as grand and unified, but they are frequently nothing more than many small acts of self-preservation aligned by circumstance. This uncertainty feeds an ongoing scholarly argument. Some historians insist the lack of manifests proves nothing beyond archival decay. Others counter that decay alone cannot explain the precision of the void. The question remains open, sharpened by every new cataloging effort and digitization project. Each rediscovered fragment raises hope that a single overlooked reference might surface, naming a ship, a date, a cargo. So far, that hope has been disappointed. The absence also complicates later testimony. When witnesses were questioned years after the fleet vanished, they spoke in generalities. Ships, goods, treasure, nothing precise. Without paperwork to anchor, memory recollections drifted, shaped by rumor and interrogation. The harbor that once thrived on detail now offered only fog, and fog, as sailors know, is not empty. It is simply information suspended out of reach. You can feel the pattern forming. Ships leaving quietly. Records dissolving gently. No dramatic rupture, only a series of ordinary decisions that collectively erase certainty. It recalls the weight of those vessels sitting low in the water, a detail that now presses harder on the imagination. Heavy cargo demands accounting. Someone knew what was aboard. Someone chose not to say. By the time royal agents began asking pointed questions, the paper answers were already gone. Not burned in spectacle, not torn out in anger, but allowed to slip into that most effective of hiding places, normal administrative silence. The fleet vanished once at sea. It vanished a second time in ink. The silence in the ledgers grows louder once you shift your attention inland, toward a king whose patience had been thinning for years. Philip IV of France did not wake up one morning and decide to destroy the Knights Templar. His conflict with them developed slowly, like financial interest compounding in the dark. By the autumn of 1307, that pressure had reached a point where even a single missing ship would have mattered, let alone an entire fleet slipping beyond reach. One historical fact is beyond dispute. Philip was deeply in debt to the order. Wars against England and Flanders had drained the royal treasury, and the crown relied heavily on Templar banking networks to move funds, secure loans, and manage royal accounts. The brothers were not merely lenders, they were custodians of state finance. This placed the king in an uncomfortable position. A ruler could tolerate powerful nobles or wealthy merchants, but an institution that knew his liabilities in detail was something else entirely. That discomfort intensified as Philip pursued monetary reforms, including the debasement of coinage measures that angered merchants and destabilized trust. The Templars, conservative by design, represented an older financial order that resisted such manipulation. To them, stability was not ideology, it was survival. To Philip, stability in someone else's hands looked suspiciously like defiance. The tension was not theological, it was arithmetic. Here, an obscure detail sharpens the picture. In the months leading up to the arrests, royal agents quietly audited properties associated with the order. These audits were not public accusations. They were inventories, lists, valuations. The crown wanted to know what could be seized. That makes the fleet's disappearance especially awkward. Ships were mobile capital. They could not be frozen by decree. They had to be physically present to be taken, and suddenly they were not. Scholars continue to debate whether Philip knew the fleet was preparing to sail. Some argue that intelligence reached the court too late, delayed by the same bureaucratic routines that had enabled the departure. Others believe the king suspected movement, but misjudged its scale, assuming a partial relocation rather than total withdrawal. No document confirms royal foreknowledge, and that absence fuels disagreement. Was the fleet a surprise or a frustration that arrived just beyond grasp? The arrests that followed soon after suggest urgency rather than calm calculation. Warrants were issued simultaneously across France, sealed in advance and opened on the same morning. Such coordination speaks to long planning. Yet planning does not equal omniscience. Philip prepared to strike an institution rooted in land and law. He was less prepared to intercept one that understood tides and distance. There is a quiet irony here worth savoring. The king, who prided himself on control over territory, underestimated the freedom of the sea. He moved pieces on a chessboard, confident of the grid, while the Templars stepped sideways onto water. It is a reminder that medieval power, for all its ceremony, had limits. Borders end at shorelines. The pressure Philip felt also explains the ferocity of his response. Confiscation required justification, and justification required narrative. If valuable assets escaped, the story of total royal victory weakened. That may explain why subsequent proceedings emphasized heresy and moral corruption rather than logistics. Sin is easier to prosecute than absence. No one asks why treasure is missing if attention is fixed on confession and fire. The earlier absence of paperwork now feels less accidental. Whether through fear, loyalty, or convenience, administrative silence aligned neatly with royal need. Officials who could not produce evidence of a departing fleet also could not be accused of allowing it. Everyone, it seems, benefited from not looking too closely. Yet questions remain open. Did Philip's pressure accelerate a plan already in motion, or did it trigger an improvised escape? Some scholars see evidence of long-term preparation, pointing to the order's habit of decentralizing assets. Others argue for last-minute decision-making, guided by rumor and intuition rather than grand design. The truth may lie between. Institutions often prepare for crises without knowing their exact form. You can almost imagine the king receiving reports that something had slipped away. Not enough detail to act, just enough to irritate. A ship unaccounted for. Then another. Then the realization that the sea had quietly balanced the books in someone else's favor. If Philip felt anger, it would have been the cold kind, the kind that calcifies into resolve. As arrests swept the realm, attention shifted. Crowds gathered, accusations multiplied. The absence of ships became a footnote overshadowed by spectacle. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond the horizon, sails filled with wind that carried no royal seal. The pressure that crushed the order on land may have been precisely what propelled it onto water. Dawn did not bring clarity. It brought noise. Bells rang in towns far from the coast, doors were forced open, and men who had gone to sleep as respected brothers of a powerful order woke to iron on their wrists. On a single morning in October 1307, arrests unfolded across France with chilling coordination. This much is firm historical ground. The warrants had been sealed in advance, carried by trusted messengers, and opened simultaneously to prevent warning from traveling faster than authority. It was a legal ambush, and in its precision, you can feel the hand of a king who had learned from past delays. What makes these arrests relevant to the vanished fleet is not their brutality, but their timing. Ships do not sail themselves. Crews must be gathered, cargo secured, tides calculated. The earlier image of La Rochelle at dusk now presses back into view because such preparation does not coexist easily with surprise. If the brothers on land were caught unaware, the brothers at sea were not. That asymmetry is the crack historians keep returning to, tapping it gently, listening for hollowness. One established fact often overlooked is that not all Templars were arrested. Some were absent, traveling, stationed abroad, or simply unaccounted for in the initial sweeps. This was not incompetence. It reflects the order's decentralized structure. Commanderies operated semi-independently, connected by habit and trust, rather than constant oversight. That same structure which frustrated royal accountants also allowed information to flow unevenly. Warnings could reach some ears while others remained blissfully ignorant. An obscure detail complicates the picture further. In a handful of later testimonies given under conditions no one would describe as comfortable, brothers hinted that rumors of impending action had circulated weeks earlier. These statements are controversial. Skeptics argue they reflect hindsight memory reshaped by fear. Others note their consistency. The whispers are vague, but they share a tone of unease rather than shock. If true, it suggests that the fleet's departure was not a panicked reaction, but a response to signals that grew too loud to ignore. Here the scholarly debate opens wider. Did the order's leadership know the exact date of the arrests, or merely sense that the climate had turned lethal? Some historians argue that precise foreknowledge would have required betrayal within the royal court, a claim that demands evidence still lacking. Others counter that medieval politics did not require leaks so much as pattern recognition. When audits intensify, questions multiply, and courtiers stop making eye contact, experienced administrators take notice. The Templars, for all their vows, were not naive. You may recall the earlier absence of paperwork, the way manifests seemed to evaporate without drama. That same quiet competence appears here. If a decision was made to move assets out of reach, it would have been framed not as an escape, but as a redistribution. Ships already under the order's control, crews already sworn to obedience, routes already familiar. Nothing theatrical. Nothing that required explanation until it was too late. There is a strange, almost dry humor in imagining the contrast. On land, royal officials marched with lists and seals, convinced they were catching an entire institution mid-breath. At sea, that institution had already exhaled. It is the kind of irony history enjoys, the kind that never announces itself with a punchline. One might even say the fleet had an excellent sense of timing, which is funny in the way accountants find funny, not the way poets do. As interrogations began, questions focused on doctrine, ritual, and morality. Logistics rarely took center stage. This was not an accident. Trials are narratives, and narratives require villains more than missing inventory. When brothers spoke of ships, it was often in passing, their words quickly redirected by examiners uninterested in nautical details. The absence of focused questioning leaves a hole modern historians struggle to fill. Silence again, not as emptiness, but as design. Some scholars argue that the arrests themselves proved the fleet's departure was known to the crown. Why strike if assets were already gone? Others see the opposite. The ferocity of the crackdown suggests frustration, an attempt to compensate for something slipping beyond control. Both interpretations find support in the same events, which tells you how finely balanced the evidence remains. You can feel the weight of that uncertainty settling. If the arrests were meant to freeze the order before it could act, they came too late for the harbor. If they were meant to punish an order already slipping away, they were devastating but incomplete. Either way, the sea had already rendered judgment. Ships once gone do not answer subpoenas. As fires were built and confessions recorded, attention fixed inland. Crowds watched history being performed in public squares. Meanwhile, the earlier image of heavy hulls easing into dark water persists stubborn and unresolved. The arrests closed doors across France, but they did not close the horizon. That fact alone suggests the fleet's departure was not coincidence. It was a decision made in the narrow space between suspicion and certainty, a space only those accustomed to risk know how to use. By the time anyone thought to ask seriously about ships, the question itself sounded almost impolite, like asking a guest why they left early after the party had already burned down. The arrests had begun. The story had shifted, and somewhere beyond the reach of warrants and wax seals, sails kept moving. Once the arrests drowned out quieter questions, attention drifted away from the ships themselves. Yet if you slow the pace again and return to those hulls sitting low in the water, the most persistent mystery surfaces not in where they went, but in what they carried. This question has attracted exaggeration for centuries, but careful investigation begins by setting limits, rather than indulging fantasy. One solid fact provides a boundary. The Knights Templar did not store limitless treasure in one place. Their wealth functioned as a network spread across commanderies, loans, deposits, and obligations. Much of it existed on parchment rather than in chests. Gold and silver certainly moved through their hands, but it moved continuously funding operations, underwriting rulers, and supporting estates. The idea of a single enormous hoard, waiting to be spirited away, collapses under basic accounting. Ships have capacity. Ledgers have balance. That does not mean the holds were empty. On the contrary, they were likely filled with items that mattered precisely because they were mobile. Coin plate reliquaries and portable documents all fit the profile. Financial instruments of the period often took physical form, including sealed contracts, debt acknowledgments, and account summaries. Losing such material would not merely cost money, it would erase memory. A debt undocumented is a debt easily denied, which may explain why Philip's accountants later struggled to quantify what they had supposedly seized. An obscure but intriguing detail appears in later inventories of confiscated Templar property. While land and buildings are listed with frustrating thoroughness, references to maritime assets are vague. Ships are mentioned, but rarely described. Cargo is implied, but not enumerated. Some historians suggest this reflects ignorance. Others argue it reflects embarrassment. To admit that valuable portable assets were gone would highlight failure. Silence again offers comfort. Scholarly debate sharpens around the possibility of documents being aboard. The order's role as banker meant it held records connecting nobles, merchants, and monarchs to obligations they preferred forgotten. If such papers left France, they would become leverage rather than loot. No surviving source states this explicitly, but the logic has drawn increasing attention. It would also explain why later proceedings focused obsessively on spiritual transgressions, while financial irregularities remained oddly blurred. You might recall the earlier absence of manifests. That absence now feels heavier. Cargo that can be named can be claimed. Cargo left undescribed slips through legal fingers. If ships carried mixed loads, some mundane, some sensitive vagueness would serve both discretion and deniability. A barrel of wine looks the same, whether it conceals coin beneath false staves or not. Medieval smugglers understood this. So did institutions accustomed to moving value quietly. There is also the matter of people. Ships carry more than objects. They carry skills. Navigators, clerks, experienced brothers trained in finance and administration would have been invaluable assets if relocated. The order's human capital often mattered more than its gold. Removing key individuals from royal reach would preserve institutional memory even as buildings were seized and seals broken. Later sightings of former Templars in foreign service, particularly in Iberia, lend circumstantial support to this idea, though certainty remains elusive. A small, almost wry observation surfaces here. Treasure hunters tend to imagine chests gleaming in torchlight. Accountants imagine ledgers. The Templars inconveniently, for everyone else, imagined systems. Systems fit on ships surprisingly well. They can be broken down, packed, and reassembled elsewhere. It is not cinematic, but it is effective, which may be the greatest crime history never forgave them for. Critics of this interpretation argue that evidence is too thin, that projecting modern financial logic onto medieval actors risks distortion. They caution against assuming foresight where improvisation might suffice. This caution is fair. Yet the Order's documented sophistication in managing funds across continents makes it difficult to dismiss the possibility entirely. The debate remains open-balanced between skepticism and pattern recognition. You can feel how this question feeds back into earlier ones. Heavy ships imply weight. Weight implies cargo. Cargo implies intent. If the fleet carried nothing of consequence, its disappearance would matter less. The sustained attention it receives suggests otherwise. People do not argue for centuries about empty hulls. As the trials consumed attention and records blurred, whatever lay within those holds continued to move farther away from inquiry. Salt spray replaced dust. Horizons replaced walls. The absence of wreckage, which will later trouble archaeologists, also supports the idea of careful loading. Overburdened ships founder. Balanced ones endure. Someone calculated capacity and risk, not just secrecy. By the time the Order's assets were formally inventoried, the most elusive category had already vanished. Land could be measured. Buildings could be listed. Ships once beyond sight became abstractions, and abstractions are where history often hides its most consequential truths. So you are left with a question that refuses to resolve cleanly. Not what fabulous treasure was taken, but what necessary pieces of an institution were removed to ensure survival beyond destruction. Gold shines. Documents whisper. People remember. Of the three, only one cannot be reclaimed by decree. The ships carried something, and whatever it was, it mattered enough to plan around tides, silence paperwork, and risk everything on a single night. That knowledge does not tell you where the fleet went. It tells you why it mattered that it went at all. When you lift your eyes from the holds and look outward, the map begins to widen in a way that feels both daring and oddly practical. West of La Rochelle stretches the Atlantic not as an empty void, but as a working highway medieval sailors knew well. This is the heart of the Atlantic route theory, which proposes that the fleet did not hug familiar coasts, but committed to open water, trusting distance to do what secrecy alone could not. It sounds bold until you remember that boldness was often the safest option when every port had ears. One established fact steadies the argument. By the early 14th century, Atlantic navigation was no longer experimental. Mariners routinely crossed between France, Iberia, England, and beyond using prevailing winds, coastal waypoints, and seasonal knowledge refined over generations. La Rochelle's sailors in particular were accustomed to long hauls carrying wine and salt to northern markets. An Atlantic departure would not have looked like madness. It would have looked like work. The winds matter here. In autumn, prevailing patterns favored westward and southwesterly movement from the French coast. This is not conjecture. It is meteorology preserved in ship logs and later compilations. A fleet leaving at the right moment could gain days, even weeks of advantage before anyone realized pursuit was necessary. You can almost hear a navigator muttering about pressure systems and currents, the medieval equivalent of checking a weather app except with more sea spray and fewer notifications. An obscure detail strengthens the case. Contemporary port records from northern Spain and western France occasionally reference sudden shortages of shipping capacity in the weeks following the disappearance. Ships were expected. They did not arrive. This does not prove a westward flight, but it hints at rerouting on a scale that disrupted normal trade. When patterns break quietly across multiple regions, historians take notice. The debate begins when destinations are proposed. Some scholars argue for a simple dispersal into the Atlantic to lose any tail, followed by landfall far from royal influence. Others suggest something more ambitious, a calculated reach toward territories beyond immediate papal or royal authority. The problem, as always, is evidence. No harbor record announces the arrival of a mysterious Templar convoy bearing no flag and many questions. That silence cuts both ways. It denies certainty while protecting possibility. You may recall the earlier discussion of paperwork evaporating. The Atlantic amplifies that effect. At sea, documentation becomes memory, and memory fades quickly once land is sighted again. If ships altered course mid-voyage or split into smaller groups, the trail would fragment beyond recovery. This is where the theory gains strength. Complexity creates deniability. Simplicity invites interception. There is also the matter of pursuit. Medieval navies were not standing forces poised for chase. They assembled slowly, argued over funding, and relied on seasonal readiness. By the time anyone might have considered sending ships after the Templars, the moment had passed. A fleet already days into the Atlantic does not wait politely for orders from shore. It keeps going. Oceans reward commitment. A small, gentle joke belongs here because sailors would appreciate it. If you are going to disappear, do it where the nearest filing cabinet is several hundred miles away. The Atlantic, for all its dangers, has never been good at keeping receipts. Critics of the theory raise fair objections. Open ocean travel increases risk. Storms, navigation errors, and supply limitations could doom even experienced crews. Yet the absence of wreckage complicates that critique. Accidental loss on the Atlantic tends to leave traces eventually washed ashore or caught in nets. Centuries of fishing have turned up older debris than this. The emptiness suggests not catastrophe, but competence. Another ongoing scholarly question concerns coordination. Did all ships follow the same course, or did they scatter once clear of surveillance? Some argue that dispersal would reduce risk. Others counter that mutual support improves survival on long passages. The truth may involve stages. Together at first, then apart. Institutions often plan exits the way birds migrate, grouping when vulnerable, separating when safe. You can sense how this theory links back to earlier pressure. Philip's reach extended across land courts and coinage. It thinned dramatically once the coastline fell behind. Choosing the Atlantic was not romantic. It was jurisdictional. Laws lose their teeth in salt water. The idea also aligns with the nature of what the ships likely carried. Portable assets, documents, people. These benefit from distance rather than concealment. A chest hidden nearby invites discovery. A chest relocated beyond political gravity becomes irrelevant. The Atlantic does not hide. It removes. As you imagine the fleet moving westward, the earlier image of a calm harbor feels almost deceptive. The true drama may have begun hours later when land disappeared and stars replaced towers. Navigation then relied on memory prayer and experience, not banners or decrees. In that space, authority redistributed itself according to who could read the sky. No single piece of evidence seals the Atlantic route theory. That is its weakness and its strength. It fits what is known without demanding what is not. It explains absence without inventing spectacle. And it leaves room for later chapters to explore where such a journey might reasonably end. For now, you are left with a horizon rather than a destination. The fleet does not sink. It does not circle back. It commits. And in committing, it chooses the one environment medieval power struggled most to control. The Atlantic is not a hiding place. It is a filter. Only plans sturdy enough to survive distance pass through. Somewhere beyond sight, sails held steady, guided by winds that owed allegiance to no king. That alone does not solve the mystery, but it narrows the field in a way that feels earned, not imagined. And it prepares you for the quieter landfalls that may have followed, where ships stop being symbols and start becoming ghosts with paperwork. If the Atlantic offered distance, the Iberian coast offered discretion. As the imagined horizon settles and land begins to return, attention naturally drifts south toward ports that lay just far enough beyond French authority to matter. The Iberian safe haven theory does not rely on dramatic discovery, but on quiet absorption, the kind that leaves no single moment to point at and say, here, this is where it happened. One historical fact anchors the discussion firmly. In the years following the arrests, the fate of the Templars diverged sharply between kingdoms. While France pursued destruction with legal fury, Portugal and parts of Spain responded with caution, delay, and eventual accommodation. The order was investigated, renamed, reorganized, but not erased. This divergence matters because ships do not need perfect refuge. They need plausible deniability and rulers willing to look the other way. Portugal in particular stands out. King Denis had long relied on Templar expertise to defend coastlines and manage frontier lands. When papal pressure mounted, he resisted outright confiscation, ultimately transforming the order's remnants into the Order of Christ. This is not conjecture. It is documented policy. What remains debated is timing. Did maritime assets arrive before this transformation quietly folding into Portuguese control, or did they follow once legal cover existed? The sequence is unclear, and that uncertainty keeps the argument alive. An obscure detail surfaces in shipping records from Lisbon and nearby ports in the early 14th century. New vessels appear under different ownership, crewed by men with unfamiliar backgrounds, yet showing operational discipline that suggests prior organization. No document labels them former Templars. None needs to. Maritime communities recognize skill long before lineage. A competent navigator asks few questions, especially when he pays his docking fees on time. You may recall earlier suggestions that ships were rebadged rather than hidden. Iberian ports made this feasible. Flags change. Names change. Hulls endure. A vessel arriving without fanfare could be sold, transferred, or repurposed within weeks. Once integrated into local fleets, tracing its origin becomes nearly impossible. Wood remembers the sea, not paperwork. Scholars continue to debate whether the Iberian kingdoms actively coordinated with fleeing Templars or merely took advantage of circumstance. Some argue that political sympathy played a role rooted in shared military history against Muslim polities. Others caution that pragmatism, not loyalty, guided decisions. Skilled sailors and administrators were valuable regardless of their past vows. The debate remains unresolved, balanced between intentional shelter and opportunistic adoption. There is also the human dimension. Ships may arrive, but people must settle. Later records show individuals with backgrounds matching Templar profiles, entering royal service managing estates, or advising on fortifications. These appearances are fragmentary, often dismissed as coincidence. Yet patterns emerge when fragments accumulate. Institutions rarely dissolve into nothing, they diffuse. A quiet callback emerges here to the earlier question of cargo. Documents and expertise would be more valuable in Iberia than gold alone. Knowledge transfers smoothly across borders. Coin attracts attention. A bundle of contracts and a mind trained to read them quietly reshapes economies. If the fleet carried such assets, Iberian absorption begins to look less like refuge and more like investment. Skeptics point out that no single Iberian port records a dramatic influx corresponding to the fleet's disappearance. This is true, and it is precisely why the theory resists collapse. Absorption does not announce itself. It works through normal channels. A ship here, a crew there, a renamed order gradually taking shape under papal blessing. History often hides its continuity behind administrative updates. There is even a faint humor in imagining papal investigators arriving years later, dutifully reviewing compliance reports, while the practical reality had already shifted beneath them. On paper, the Templars were gone. On the water, their methods persisted. Bureaucracy congratulated itself, unaware it was applauding a costume change. The Iberian coast also fits the Atlantic logic. A westward departure need not end in endless ocean. It can arc south, guided by winds and familiarity toward ports known to be politically flexible. Such a route balances risk and reward, offering both distance and shelter. It does not require mythic leaps across seas, only careful navigation and patience. You can feel the investigation tightening. The fleet does not vanish into fantasy. It threads through real harbors, real policies, and real people making pragmatic choices under pressure. Iberia does not solve the mystery entirely, but it provides a landscape where disappearance becomes survivable. As ships settle into new rhythms under new flags, the absence back in France grows more permanent. Each day that passes without inquiry hardens silence into fact. By the time anyone might have traced hulls southward, the trail would already be submerged beneath routine. The Iberian safe haven theory remains compelling, not because it dazzles, but because it aligns with how institutions endure. They do not flee screaming into the night. They relocate, rename, and resume. The sea carries them part of the way. Politics carries them the rest. As the southern routes suggest discretion, the northern horizon introduces defiance. When attention shifts toward Scotland, the theory changes tone, not in volume, but in posture. This is no longer about quiet absorption into friendly systems. It is about moving toward a place temporarily beyond the reach of both Pope and King, a political fracture where authority itself was unsettled enough to offer cover. One historical fact gives this idea its footing. In the years surrounding 1307, Scotland was in open conflict with England, and its relationship with Rome was strained to the point of rupture. Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated, and papal authority north of the border carried little practical weight. This mattered deeply. Papal bulls condemning the order did not travel well into contested territory. Law weakens when enforcement cannot follow. The timing is what draws scholars' attention. The fleet's disappearance coincides with a moment when Scotland, unlike most of Europe, was legally and politically misaligned with the campaign against the Templars. While France moved swiftly and England hesitated, Scotland existed in a kind of institutional fog. If ships sought a place where questions would be delayed rather than answered, this was it. An obscure but persistent detail surfaces in later Scottish records. References appear to unidentified foreign knights, and skilled fighting men entering service during the early years of Robert the Bruce's reign. These men are rarely named, and their origins are left vague. Skeptics argue this reflects the chaos of war, not secret arrivals. Yet the pattern of professional experience combined with sudden availability keeps the question alive. Soldiers do not materialize from nowhere, especially ones accustomed to discipline and hierarchy. Here, the earlier image of ships dispersing begins to feel relevant again. A northern route would not require the entire fleet to commit together. Smaller groups peeling away after clearing French waters could slip into Scottish harbors with minimal notice. Ports accustomed to irregular wartime arrivals would not demand tidy explanations. Survival trumps curiosity when borders burn. The scholarly debate centers on evidence, or rather the lack of definitive maritime proof. No port log announces the arrival of a Templar fleet in Scotland. Critics point to this absence as fatal. Proponents counter that Scottish ports of the period left far fewer records than their continental counterparts, and those that existed suffered from later destruction. Absence here proves less than it might elsewhere. You may recall the earlier discussion of jurisdiction. On land, Philip's reach extended through courts and coin. At sea, it thinned. In Scotland, it vanished entirely. Choosing such a destination would not have been romantic. It would have been strategic. When law fractures movement thrives. There is also the question of motive. Why choose Scotland over safer Iberian arrangements? The answer may lie not in safety, but in leverage. Scotland offered not just refuge, but relevance. Skilled knights and administrators could trade expertise for protection. In a kingdom fighting for survival, experience was currency. This is where human cargo again outweighs gold. A quiet irony emerges when you consider later legend. Stories of Templars at Bannockburn appear centuries after the battle, embellished and unreliable. Scholars rightly dismiss them as myth. Yet myths often form around real absences, around questions that were never fully answered. The persistence of these tales suggests not proof, but discomfort. Something about the period invites speculation, because clarity never arrived. Critics caution against retrofitting romance onto logistics. They argue that turning north would increase risk navigating hostile waters and unpredictable politics. This caution is valid, yet risk does not preclude calculation. Institutions facing extinction sometimes choose uncertain ground over certain destruction. The sea does not promise safety, it promises possibility. You can feel how this theory interacts with earlier ones rather than replacing them. The fleet does not need a single destination. Disappearance works best when it fractures. Some ships south, some west, some north. The question is not where all of them went, but whether any one route explains total absence. Scotland contributes to that mosaic by offering a zone where records thin and authority blurs. There is even a subtle administrative echo here. If assets or people arrived in Scotland, they would not reappear in papal correspondence or royal inventories. They would dissolve into wartime necessity. That disappearance would be complete, not because it was hidden, but because no one had the luxury of asking. As you imagine ships approaching a rugged coast under clouded skies, the earlier calm of La Rochelle feels distant. This is not a place of tidy docks and clerks with ledgers. It is a place of rough landings and quick decisions, perfect for forgetting. The Scottish corridor does not solve the mystery outright. It complicates it, which may be closer to truth. Disappearances on this scale rarely rely on one door. They use many, each partially open, none labeled. Scotland, briefly and quietly, may have been one of them. If refugee explains survival, disguise explains permanence. Once ships reached waters where immediate pursuit no longer mattered, the greater challenge became something quieter and more enduring: how to stop being recognizable. The theory that the fleet vanished in plain sight rests not on dramatic concealment, but on administrative transformation so ordinary it leaves no scar. One historical fact grounds this idea firmly. Medieval ships were not fixed identities. Names changed. Ownership transferred. Flags shifted with political convenience. A vessel's legal existence depended less on its hull than on who claimed it and under what authority. Ports cared about dues, not backstories. If paperwork appeared plausible, scrutiny ended there. This is how maritime commerce functioned, and the Templars understood commerce intimately. An obscure but telling detail appears in legal disputes from the early 14th century, involving ships whose origins are described vaguely as formerly belonging elsewhere. Such phrasing is not uncommon, yet its frequency increases in the years immediately following the order's collapse. Some historians see coincidence, others see residue. When many ships lose their past at once, questions arise about why forgetting suddenly became fashionable. The practical mechanics of disguise were straightforward. A ship entering a friendly or neutral port could be sold on paper while remaining in the same hands operationally. A trusted intermediary, perhaps a merchant with no visible ties to the order, would assume ownership. Crews could be partially replaced or supplemented. A new name painted on the stern, a different banner raised at the mast, and continuity dissolves into reinvention. To a harbor master, it was Tuesday. You might recall earlier discussion of Iberian ports absorbing vessels quietly. This theory extends that logic. Absorption does not require secrecy if legality provides cover. Once a ship became Portuguese Castilian, or even privately owned, pursuing its previous identity became pointless. Law follows labels. Change the label and the law politely looks away. Scholars debate whether such transformations required coordination at high levels or emerged organically as opportunities arose. Some argue that rebadging on this scale implies planning networks prepared in advance and financial arrangements ready to activate. Others suggest improvisation guided by experience rather than blueprint. The debate remains unresolved, but both positions agree on one point: disguise was feasible, and it worked often enough to be invisible. There is a small, almost affectionate irony here. Institutions fear chaos, yet chaos is exactly what helps identity dissolve. After the arrests, confusion reigned. Authorities focused on interrogations, not hull registries. The moment was ideal for paperwork to slip through gaps. Even diligent clerks cannot chase moving targets while fires burn in public squares. The absence of wrecks, which will trouble later investigators, also aligns with this theory. Ships that continue sailing do not announce themselves to archaeology. They age, are repaired, sold, again broken up, rebuilt. Wood becomes other wood. Iron becomes other iron. The sea erases not by swallowing, but by reuse. Critics argue that some trace should remain a distinctive feature, a persistent name. Yet medieval standardization was minimal. Ships were tools, not monuments. Their individuality mattered only to those who worked them. Once crews dispersed and ownership changed, memory scattered. Oral histories dissolve faster than parchment when no one is rewarded for remembering. A gentle joke belongs here because paperwork deserves it. If you have ever tried to trace the ownership of a used car across multiple countries centuries later, you understand the problem. Now imagine that car is made of wood, constantly repaired, and the registration office burned down twice. Disappearance begins to feel less mysterious. This theory also explains why later generations hunted for a dramatic end that never existed. They searched for wrecks, battles, betrayals. What they missed was boredom. Ships doing what ships do best, carrying goods, changing hands, wearing different names, and refusing to perform their past for historians. You can feel how this possibility loops back to earlier questions about cargo and people. Once dispersed under new flags, whatever the ships carried ceased to be Templar property in any meaningful sense. Documents became local archives, expertise became royal service, gold became coin again. The fleet did not vanish. It dissolved. Some scholars remain uncomfortable with this conclusion because it lacks spectacle. There is no single moment to point at no satisfying revelation. Yet history often works this way. The most effective disappearances are administrative. They rely on systems behaving exactly as designed. As the fleet slipped into new identities, the story back in France hardened into a tragedy with clear villains and victims. That clarity depended on ignoring the sea. By the time anyone might have looked outward again, the ships were no longer fugitives. They were citizens. The idea of disguise does not compete with earlier routes. It completes them. Atlantic distance buys time. Safe havens offer shelter. New flags provide permanence. Together they form a process rather than an event. And processes once finished leave very little to find. The fleet was never meant to be discovered because it was never meant to remain what it had been. It changed quietly, efficiently, and without asking permission. The sea did not hide it. Bureaucracy did. As ships slipped into new identities, attention inevitably turns toward the one institution that should have noticed everything and said something about it. The Vatican kept records obsessively. Papal correspondence mandates, inquiries, and reports formed a web intended to bind Christendom together with ink. And yet when it comes to the vanished fleet, that web thins to near transparency. The silence is not total, but it is conspicuous. One established fact frames the problem. Pope Clement V was deeply involved in the suppression of the order, issuing bulls, convening councils, and responding to royal pressure with careful language. The machinery of investigation churned relentlessly. Questions were asked about doctrine, initiation rites, property, and obedience. What is striking is how rarely ships appear in this correspondence. Considering the scale of maritime assets attributed to the order, this omission demands explanation. An obscure detail sharpens the discomfort. In several papal letters discussing confiscation assets are referenced broadly as lands, houses, and goods with maritime property, either folded vaguely into other effects or ignored altogether. Some scholars argue this reflects ignorance. Others see strategy. Naming ships would invite questions about where they were. Silence avoids the risk of contradiction. The debate centers on whether the Vatican knew more than it recorded. One school of thought suggests that papal officials were genuinely uninformed, relying on reports filtered through royal channels that emphasized moral charges over logistical realities. Another proposes that knowledge existed, but was deliberately minimized to preserve institutional authority. A pope who admits he cannot locate an entire fleet looks less like a shepherd and more like a bystander. You may recall the earlier pattern of administrative quiet. Paperwork vanished at the port. Manifests blurred. Royal inventories grew vague. The papal silence feels like the final layer of insulation, sealing the absence in legitimacy. Once Rome stops asking, the question stops existing in official reality. There is also the political context to consider. Clement V owed his position in part to French influence. Openly challenging Philip IV over missing assets would strain an already delicate relationship. Scholars note that papal language during this period is careful to affirm cooperation rather than confrontation. Silence, again, functions as diplomacy. Critics caution against overreading absence. Medieval correspondence is uneven, and papal archives are not immune to loss. This is true. Yet when silence aligns so neatly with inconvenience, historians grow suspicious. The Vatican documented disputes over far smaller matters with ferocious detail. That it did not pursue ships suggests either resignation or calculation. A small dry observation surfaces here. Institutions often record what they can enforce. Ships at sea are famously resistant to enforcement. It may have seemed more practical to focus on land bodies and doctrine, leaving the ocean to God. Bureaucracy, after all, prefers stable surfaces. As years passed, the opportunity for inquiry faded. By the time councils debated the order's fate, the fleet's absence had hardened into assumption. If Rome did not ask where the ships were, future generations would not expect an answer. Silence became precedent. This quiet also shaped later myth-making. Without papal denial or confirmation, imagination filled the gap. Treasure, holy relics, secret missions, all of it grows more easily in a vacuum. Ironically, the Vatican's restraint may have nourished the legends it never intended to create. When you step back, the pattern repeats with unsettling consistency. Local clerks looked away. Royal accountants avoided detail. Papal letters spoke around the issue. Each layer reinforced the next, until absence itself became the official position. The silence does not tell you where the fleet went. It tells you something else, perhaps more revealing. At every level of authority, asking the question proved less useful than letting it fade. Ships disappear most effectively when no one powerful insists they be found. If the sea had claimed the fleet, it should have left something behind. This is the quiet assumption that underpins centuries of speculation, and it is also where the mystery becomes most stubborn. Oceans destroy, but they also return. Wood drifts, iron sinks, but is found. Nets snag. Shores receive what the deep grows tired of holding. Yet when it comes to the Templar fleet, the sea has remained unnervingly well-mannered. One established fact frames the problem. Medieval shipwrecks are not rare. Archaeologists and fishermen have located vessels far older than the early 14th century across the Atlantic and European coasts. Storms, collisions, and navigational errors left material traces that time did not erase completely. The absence of any credible wreck associated with the fleet is therefore not neutral. It weighs against the idea of sudden catastrophe. An obscure but telling detail emerges from medieval maritime insurance practices. Merchants recorded losses meticulously when ships foundered, because loss justified claims and renegotiations. These records, though scattered, survive in surprising number. They mention storms, pirates, reefs, and disputes over liability. What they do not mention is a sudden massive loss of multiple vessels departing La Rochelle in the same window. Silence here is not romantic. It is financial, and finance rarely forgets. Scholars debate whether the fleet could have been destroyed far enough offshore to erase evidence entirely. Some argue that a violent Atlantic storm could scatter wreckage beyond recovery. Others counter that storms do not discriminate. They leave debris unevenly, but they leave it nonetheless. The complete lack of shoreline material, even centuries later, weakens the case for disaster. You may recall the earlier discussion of careful loading and balanced hulls. That detail returns with force. Ships that sink quickly tend to be overloaded, poorly maintained, or poorly navigated. The Templars, for all their faults, were not careless logisticians. Their maritime operations had sustained decades of trade. If anything, these vessels were likely in better condition than average. Accidental loss becomes harder to argue when competence is consistent. There is also the human trace to consider. Shipwrecks produce survivors as often as corpses. Sailors wash ashore. Stories circulate. Local memory absorbs tragedy. No coastal folklore from the period preserves a tale of Templar sailors drowning en masse. Legends arise quickly around disasters. Here, legend is absent, which is itself revealing. A small, almost uncomfortable humor surfaces. The sea is famous for drama. When it takes something, it tends to announce itself loudly. For it to swallow an entire fleet in silence would be out of character, like a storm that apologizes afterward. Critics of the disappearance theory argue that archaeology is incomplete, that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. This caution is correct. Yet archaeology has a way of surprising pessimists. Nets dredge old iron. Construction reveals forgotten hulls. The longer the silence persists, the louder it becomes. This chapter of the investigation feeds directly into earlier conclusions. If ships did not sink, they sailed. If they sailed, they went somewhere. That somewhere must accommodate continued operation rather than abrupt end. The absence of graves, both literal and administrative, suggests continuity rather than collapse. Some scholars propose partial loss, with some ships wrecked and others surviving. This compromise appeals to moderation, but it struggles with proportion. Even partial disaster would leave traces. The uniformity of absence argues against mixed outcomes. As you sit with this realization, the sea begins to feel less like a suspect and more like an accomplice. Not because it hid evidence, but because it provided space, distance, time. Ships that keep sailing eventually stop being questions. The lack of wreckage does not solve the mystery. It narrows it decisively. Catastrophe fades. Accident retreats. What remains is intent. Someone planned for these vessels to survive beyond scrutiny. When history offers no bodies, no debris, and no cries carried ashore, it is often because nothing ended. Something continued elsewhere quietly, persistently, and with no obligation to report back. The sea did not claim the fleet. It carried it. Even when ships leave no wreckage, people usually leave traces. Sailors talk. Merchants gossip. Officials complain. Maritime worlds are small, and silence on this scale feels unnatural unless something presses down on it. When you turn from water to witnesses, the mystery shifts, again becoming less about geography and more about behavior. People knew something. The question is why so many chose not to carry that knowledge forward. One historical fact anchors this unease. Testimonies from the period, especially those gathered during inquisitions and royal inquiries, are extensive and detailed on matters of ritual belief and alleged misconduct. Names are recorded. Dates are argued over. Yet when ships enter these accounts, they do so faintly, as if spoken through cloth. Witnesses acknowledge maritime activity, then retreat into vagueness. For an order so visibly tied to ports and transport, this restraint is striking. An obscure detail deepens the concern. In a handful of early depositions, references appear to brothers who were absent on business or not present in the realm at the time of arrest. These phrases recur without clarification. Some historians dismiss them as formulaic language. Others note how conveniently they avoid specifying direction or purpose. Absence is named but not explored. Scholars debate whether fear shaped these testimonies more than fact. Interrogations were not safe spaces for nuance. Speaking about ships that escaped royal seizure, could be interpreted as complicity or defiance. Silence in that environment becomes self-preservation. It is easier to confess imagined sins than to explain real logistics that implicate others still at large. You may recall earlier suggestions that paperwork vanished not through fire, but discretion. The same principle applies to memory. Witnesses adapt their stories to survive. Over time, those adaptations harden. What begins as omission becomes truth by repetition. Eventually, no one remembers having known more. There is also the question of who was never questioned at all. Sailors, dock workers, and merchants occupied social strata less likely to be called before inquisitors, unless accused directly. Their voices survive only indirectly through later records that strip away context. If they spoke among themselves, those conversations dissolved with them. Oral history is fragile when it is not valued. A quiet, almost grim humor surfaces here. Medieval justice excelled at extracting answers to questions it already wanted to hear. It was far less effective at discovering information it had not thought to ask for. No one put the fleet on trial, so the fleet never testified. Some scholars suggest active suppression beyond fear, pointing to witnesses who altered accounts over time. Early statements mention ships more freely. Later ones grow cautious. This shift could reflect memory decay, but it could also reflect learning. People observe consequences. They notice which topics prolong questioning and which shorten it. Silence spreads socially. This behavior aligns with patterns seen elsewhere in the investigation. Clerks avoided detail. Papal letters spoke around absence. Now witnesses follow the same path. It begins to feel less like coincidence and more like collective adjustment, a society aligning itself with the safest version of events. Critics caution against attributing intention to silence. Not every gap hides a secret. Sometimes people simply did not know. This is fair. Yet the consistency of withdrawal across regions and roles suggests more than ignorance. It suggests awareness paired with caution. You can feel how this shapes the fleet's disappearance. Ships move once. Silence moves continuously. Each retelling strips away specificity until only the outline remains. A fleet sailed. It was never seen again. The details dissolve not because they were unknown, but because they were unspoken. As years turned into decades, those who might have known firsthand aged out of relevance. New generations inherited a story already thinned. By the time curiosity returned, witnesses were gone, and with them the chance to reconstruct unfiltered memory. This does not mean everyone colluded. It means survival favors forgetting. In a world where words could condemn restraint became wisdom. The fleet benefited from this long after it passed beyond sight. When you listen closely to the testimonies that survive, you do not hear lies. You hear avoidance. And avoidance repeated often enough creates the most durable kind of disappearance. By now, the pieces begin to align into something that feels less accidental and more deliberate. Not a single dramatic maneuver, but a sequence of small, competent decisions made by people accustomed to risk. When scholars speak of a coordinated extraction, they are not proposing a grand, centralized conspiracy whispered in candlelit halls. They are describing a system behaving exactly as it was designed to behave under pressure. One established fact anchors this synthesis. The Knights Templar operated as a decentralized network. Commanderies managed local affairs with considerable autonomy while adhering to shared procedures and trust. This structure made the order efficient in peace and resilient in crisis. When danger emerged, not every node needed the same information at the same time. Some acted, others waited. The system flexed rather than shattered. You can see this flexibility reflected in timing. The fleet sailed just before arrests began, not weeks earlier and not after. That window is narrow enough to imply awareness, yet wide enough to avoid the need for perfect intelligence. It suggests leaders who sensed inevitability without knowing its precise shape. This is how experienced institutions survive political shifts. They do not wait for certainty. They move when probability tips against them. An obscure but revealing detail lies in the Order's financial habits. The Templars routinely redistributed assets across regions to balance risk, a practice well documented in surviving account fragments. Funds flowed toward stability and away from volatility. Applied to ships, this logic implies pre-existing plans for maritime relocation. The fleet's disappearance may not have been improvised. It may have been activated. Scholars debate how far in advance such planning extended. Some argue that contingency arrangements existed years before the arrests, reflecting long-standing tension with secular rulers. Others see the extraction as accelerated rather than invented in 1307, a plan rushed, but not conceived in panic. The debate remains open, but both sides agree on one point. What happened required coordination, not coincidence. Earlier questions about routes now settle into pattern. Some ships heading west, others south, perhaps a few north. Dispersal reduces risk and complicates pursuit. It also explains why no single destination yields answers. The fleet did not vanish into one place. It dissolved across many, each movement modest enough to avoid notice. You may recall the absence of manifests and the rebadging of vessels. These were not isolated tricks. They were components of a broader process. Documentation blurred. Identity shifted. Assets reappeared as something else. Each step alone looks mundane. Together they form an exit strategy. There is a faint, dry humor in recognizing how unromantic this is. History often expects collapse to look like chaos. Here it looks like administration. The Order did not rage against its fate. It filed it away and moved what mattered. Critics of the coordinated extraction theory caution against attributing too much foresight. They warn that seeing design in retrospect risks overstating control. This caution deserves respect. Yet when multiple independent lines of evidence converge on intentional movement, the burden shifts. Coincidence can explain one anomaly. It struggles with many. The human element reinforces this reading. Key individuals disappear from records at exactly the wrong moment to be accidental. Skilled men resurface elsewhere under new roles. Knowledge persists even as names change. Institutions do not survive on gold alone. They survive on people who know how to rebuild. As the arrests consumed attention and trials monopolized narrative, the extraction completed itself quietly. By the time anyone might have coordinated a response, the opportunity had passed. Assets were already embedded in new contexts, protected not by secrecy, but by normalcy. This is the unsettling conclusion you are being guided toward. The disappearance was not a failure of detection. It was a success of planning. The fleet left because it was supposed to leave, not because the sea intervened. By the end of this process, nothing remained to recover. Ships had become ships again, stripped of symbolic weight. People had become citizens, advisors, soldiers, clerks. Documents had found new shelves. The Order as a legal entity collapsed. Its operational core did not. What remains unresolved is not whether coordination occurred, but how consciously it was understood by those involved. Did every participant grasp the scale of what they were part of? Or did each simply do their job, trusting a system that had never failed them before? History rarely answers that kind of question cleanly. It leaves you with a pattern and asks whether you recognize intent in it. At this point, the pattern is difficult to ignore. The fleet did not flee blindly. It executed a withdrawal measured, distributed, and final. And by doing so, it ensured that when the order fell, it did not fall empty-handed. By now, the question no longer presses the way it once did. It has softened, settling into a shape that feels less like mystery and more like recognition. The fleet did not vanish because history lost track of it. It vanished because the people responsible understood exactly how history works and how easily it can be guided away from what it is not ready to see. When you gather the strands together, no single explanation demands belief on its own. But taken as a whole, they form something sturdier than legend. The timing aligns too precisely. The absence of wreckage persists too completely. The paperwork thins too conveniently. Witnesses retreat in ways that feel learned rather than accidental. And above all, the institutional behavior remains consistent. This was not panic. It was withdrawal. The most plausible escape, then, is not a dramatic one. There were no flaming horizons or final stands against the sea. Instead, ships departed under routine cover, carrying what mattered most, because it could not be replaced. They moved into spaces where authority weakened, where identity could be adjusted, where continuity could survive without banners. Some were absorbed. Some were dispersed. All were allowed to become ordinary again. There is a strange calm in accepting this. History often teaches us to expect endings to be loud. Yet the most effective endings are quiet. They leave no ruins to admire, no graves to mourn, no artifacts to catalogue. They leave processes completed and questions unresolved, which is far more durable. You can almost feel the pace slow now, as if the story itself is growing tired of insisting. The harbor at La Rochelle fades back into darkness, its water smooth, indifferent. The ships are long gone, not hiding, not waiting, simply living out their second lives in places that no longer cared who they used to be. Perhaps that is why the mystery endures, not because the truth is inaccessible, but because it is unsatisfying to those who crave spectacle. There is no treasure chest to unearth, no single map to reveal. Only the understanding that institutions survive by adapting faster than their enemies can react. As you rest with that thought, the edges of the story blur gently. Dates lose their sharpness. Names drift. What remains is movement purposeful and unremarkable, carried by tides that owe allegiance to nothing at all. The sea does not remember orders or kings. It remembers only passage, and so the fleet was never meant to be found, because it never truly disappeared. It changed state, slipped into normality, and let history argue with itself while it sailed on. The night did not swallow it. The night released it. You can let the question settle now, no longer demanding an answer, only acknowledgement. Some secrets endure not because they are hidden well, but because they resolve themselves quietly and ask nothing further of us but attention and then rest.